To get started this morning, this is the last Ecclesiastes class of the year, maybe ever. But if you have your notes, look at page 26. I have a. Let me see if I have a copy of it on my notes here. Solomon, throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, is constantly going to push us. So we're actually there. We go. I have it. Sorry about that. So in Ecclesiastes, he's building all the different cases, and he's building to a point. And so in Ecclesiastes 12, it is a big, giant poem about old age. And so, obviously you have a comic that goes along with this because that's fun. But this is basically what Solomon is asking each of us to do. You think about yourself as an old person, and then think about all the time you've wasted, regretting what you didn't do with your life, that you're all filled with regret, and then you open your eyes and you're old anyway. And so it's just, this is Ecclesiastes 12. Solomon is building to the point throughout the book of Ecclesiastes where he is constantly saying, basically think about the end. Think about the end. Like, what direction are you going to? What are you trying to do with your life? And it's just something you have to think through. I'm not saying be morbid. I'm not saying be morose about it. Solomon actually will specifically say to enjoy your life. But he is constantly bringing up the idea of you got to think toward the end. Like last week we talked about suffering. We talked about all the hardship, all the things that you can go through. It's not a light subject. I'm actually chatting with someone right now who, it was offense and bullying and things that happened in their life, and that pushed them away from Christianity and into all sorts of other things. I'm not saying that's right, and I'm not saying we should take that lightly, but there's a level, if you talk to a lot of people, the suffering, like why is there suffering in the world? Why is there hardship? Why is God allowing evil? That is a question that trips up so many people. But if we have a proper view of God, if we have a proper view of the world, I think it will get us on the right foot to be able to handle this type of stuff better. It's something I've been thinking through a lot lately, just because of who I've been talking to and various people who they're living Ecclesiastes. But the last two people I've gotten into conversations about the gospel and stuff with, the problem of evil has come up. So that's been both of the times in the last month or so. Problem of evil come up. Why does God do things a certain way? I mean, those type of questions are the questions that are going to come up. And so I think the way it ties in with us, we have to be fully convinced in ourselves, that God is a good God and that God is a loving God. Like those are things we have to. I'm not saying we have to convince ourselves of. I don't know a better way to word it. If you have a better way to word that, but if we are confused and don't have a solid footing, we're not going to be able to help a lot of other people. Is the point. Now let's go over Ecclesiastes chapter 12. That way we can say we finished the book, and then we'll hop back to Ecclesiastes 5, and we'll cover a few of these things. Ecclesiastes 5 and so on. Actually, the whole book of Ecclesiastes. Like I said, it's building to a point, but there's going to be things in it that if you don't understand the culture, there's going to be aspects that you're just kind of like, I don't know what this is talking about. So Ecclesiastes chapter 12 is one of those sections where it is a giant poem on getting old. So that's basically what happens. As you look, Ecclesiastes chapter 12, it says, "Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them." So first point here with Ecclesiastes is he's saying old age is going to sap you of the enjoyment of things that you otherwise enjoyed. There are things now that you're like, I used to enjoy that, I just don't. I'm not quite at the old man stage, but I'm definitely at the point now where there's certain like candies and sugar things that I'm like, I just don't like them anymore. When I was a kid, I tried to give my dad an Airhead, which we all know is like solid sugar, somehow packed more sugar in it than could possibly hold in it. It's like the TARDIS of sugar. But you've got all that stuff, And I remember trying to give it to my dad, and he was like, oh, no, I can't eat that stuff. Like, ugh. And I was like, how could you not like an airhead? Okay, I'm pretty sure if I tried to have an airhead right now, I'd be like, oh, no, I can't eat that. Like, I'm that person. All right, and so age, yeah, I have become my father. If you've ever heard his voice, I have become my father. As you continue through the account, it says, while the sun or the light of the moon and the stars be not darkened, nor the clouds return after the rain, in the day when the keepers of the house shall tremble, the strong men shall bow themselves, the grinders cease because they are few. Oh boy, am I living that one. And those that look out the windows be darkened. These are all pictures of the various parts of your body shutting down and not working anymore. So your eyesight is starting to go. So verse 2 talks about the windows be darkened, the clouds aren't returning after the rain, and your eyesight's going bad. Okay, like everything's either too dark or too bright, or it's just a mess. 3b again talks about those that look out the windows be darkened. It's just poetic language for you're old and falling apart. Your body begins to stoop and tremble, and so you've got this picture in verse 3 that the strong men shall bow themselves. And so I saw this with my grandpa. He was just this strong guy. I mean, he wasn't built like a strong guy, but he was just physically fit, and the stuff he could build and the stuff he could do, I mean, it was amazing, the stuff. But then as he got older and his heart started to give out on him and stuff, like he just, you see the old man who just kind of like crumples in on himself, and that's the picture that Solomon is painting here. You've got the strong men who are bowing themselves, and so a man who used to be like this is now like this, and then of course we know what the grinders are. The teeth, they are ceasing because they are few. It means your teeth are falling out, which is a wonderful circumstance. I used to literally chew metal and my teeth could hold up onto it. Now it's like popcorn kernels and they break it and you're like, are you serious? So take care of your teeth, kids. And then verse 4, it says, the doors shall be shut in the street when the sound of the grinding is low. He shall rise up at the voice of the bird, and all the daughters of music shall be brought low. Again, the idea of your hearing begins to fade, or you hear things that are like, everything becomes an annoyance. And so what he's doing is he's painting this big picture. I'm not going to go through the whole passage because you get the point. But he's going through all of this stuff, and he's basically saying, when you look at your life, and you're trying to find the motivation for living, that's why I put the comic up there. When you're trying to find the motivation for living, you think about the fact that you won't be able to do this when you're old. Like there are certain things that you have the physical fitness right now to do. You will not have that in 40 years. Your body will be broken and stooped, and you'll have pains that you just, and he's saying, remember now your Creator. Serve him now in the days of your youth before these evil days come to pass, because this is sad. And so he's basically saying, serve God in this moment before all this stuff comes flooding at you. Just if you want explanation for the other parts here, sleeplessness, that's what 4b is. You can't seem to go to sleep. These little things are waking you up. You got things like you're just afraid of everything. Falling is a big deal. Like now you fall, you're like, oh, whatever. As you get older, you fall, it could be a death sentence. That's literally how my great-grandmother died. She fell and got a blood clot in her leg, and she died from it. And you're like, you died of falling over? Yes. So those are the things that we take for granted when you're young, but what the Bible is doing is it's trying to remind us that that's not how this is always going to be. Now, there's several other images here. So ever the golden bowl be loose, and so it's just more images to your body is breaking, you're going to die, and then finally, the end of the section is weakness and death. And so those are just all pictures. It's a very, very encouraging passage. If you've ever, I'm just kidding. But the point is not to just remember that you're going to get old. The point is to point you here to say, remember God. So. It's not a surprise that throughout the Bible it's going to repeatedly say, flee youthful lusts. Because there are certain things that are characteristic of the young. Foolishness, living for pleasure, just giving into whatever you desire, not having a long-term view on things. Those are kind of stereotypical youthful lusts. They're not they're not decisions that are normally tempered with wisdom. And so what Solomon is doing is he's kind of repeating that motif by saying, don't live for the youthful pleasures. Don't just go after them. Like, yes, enjoy, like live with the wife of your youth. Enjoy it. That's great. He's going to say things like that. But he's also saying, but you need to think long term. Because you have a physical body right now that is strong and fit, and you need to use that to serve God while you have that physical strength. Because there's coming a day where you may say, well, I don't really have the physical desire to do all those sinful things anymore. Now I'll serve God. And he's like, but your body also is now broken down, so good luck with that. So he's trying to remind us, God gave you a physical body that is fit and strong, so use it properly. Use it for God. And you'll see in the end of chapter 11, just to prove this point, verse 9, it says, Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth, and let thy heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth. And walk in the ways of thine heart and in the sight of thine eyes, but know thou that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. So he's saying, it is not wrong to enjoy your life. It is not wrong to go and do the things that you like. That's not wrong. But understand that God will bring you into judgment for the things that you do. So take that into consideration. Verse 12, Therefore remove sorrow from thy heart and put away evil from thy flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity. And then he goes with the very next verse, because childhood is vanity and youth is vanity, remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth. So I think it does a disservice to Ecclesiastes, to be completely honest, that they put the chapter break between verse 10 and chapter 12. I think if they were going to do it, they should have put the chapter break back before verse 9. I don't know why, but you know that. Like, sometimes when you're reading through, you're like, why did you put a verse break right here? It's in the middle of a sentence. Or why did you put a chapter break here? But someone, probably in the 1700s, just decided, let's break this thing up. And it just doesn't fit. So to get the full context of Ecclesiastes 12, you read a little bit into chapter 11 to get that really end statement, and then it builds right into this. Now, as you remember God is the source of life. Okay, so you look at verse 7, it says, Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, talking about your physical body, and the spirit shall return unto the God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity. And so he's summarizing up, and then in verse 9 he'll continue with his point. He said, you'll return to the dust. Basically, all your stuff will go to other people. Everything you've lived for is now done. And so again, Solomon repeats the thing he's been talking about the whole time, to just say, it's just vanity. I mean, that's just, and he could be implying it's frustration, it could be emptiness. There's all sorts of meanings, as we talked about earlier. And so that's where Solomon is going. He's saying, like, you can live for all this stuff, but understand that you will die someday. Your soul will return to the God who gave it. And as we read in the New Testament, you are going to be called to give an account with what you did with your time. And it's important to remember this, though, that God is the source of life. He gives it and he takes it. I mean, that's this idea. I'm pretty sure I've said it in this series, but this idea, we used to have the idea that God, when he decided to take you, he's just like, okay, I'm going to take you. But really what it is God is sustaining us throughout. And the moment we die is the moment God says, okay, I'm not sustaining you anymore. So like God is supporting us all along. He's keeping us alive. And then when we get to the end, God says, okay, come back. I mean, that's this idea. I used to have more of the idea of God would just choose a day and be like, okay, and you're dead. But it's more of God saying, you're alive, you're alive, you're alive, you're alive, you're alive, you're alive. You're not alive. I mean, that is the picture here. And he's saying there's going to come a day where your body returns to the dust, your soul returns to the God who gave it to you. That's going to happen. And all of your things and all of your possessions and all of your cares, they're just vanity. They just poof. All right. Another one here because it's fun. This plays into the next section of Ecclesiastes chapter 12. So I'll give you a chance because it's fun. It really is. So again, this is the natural, okay, we are considering what Ecclesiastes has put before us. We are looking at the things Ecclesiastes has taught us. It's a lot to take in. There's a ton. And so obviously our brain has certain conclusions, our desires have other conclusions. But you can see this is how most people handle problems in their life. They're like, let's numb it with something else. But again, Solomon's going to keep drawing us back. Now, one of the things that Solomon studied, one of the things that Solomon did is he said, I went after wisdom. I sought wisdom, I sought understanding. And I think some people use wisdom and understanding as a crutch. I don't know if you've ever met those guys who they're perpetual students, but not in a good way. They're not actually learning anything beneficial. You know what I'm talking about? They're the ones who they graduate college and you're like, what are you going to do? And it's like, I'm going to go to, master's or seminary. And you're like, cool. What are you studying? This. What are you going to use it for? Oh, I don't know. And then they go and they get another degree and another degree. And like 10 years later, you're like, are you still here? Like, go do something with your life. Like, what on earth? And it's like, all right, I just need more knowledge. Okay. So what Solomon's going to do is, as he wraps this up, look at verse 9. He says, moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yea, he gave good heed and sought out and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought that which was acceptable words, and that which was written was upright, even the words of truth. And then he says, the words of the wise are as goads, and as nails fastened by the masters of assembly, which are given by one shepherd. We explained that earlier, so I'm not going to do it again. And then he says, and further, by these, my son, by these words, by these things that I have time tested and really condensed down to get to their perfect spot. By these, my son, be admonished. And he says, of the making of many books there is no end. Much study is the weariness of the flesh. And that seems like such an arbitrary, like, why did you throw that in? And I think it is. Solomon's tendency was to study and research and just do so much work. And what he was trying to say is, you don't all have to do that. Like, studying is good, research is good, learning is good, going to school is good, all of that is great. But make sure you're being admonished by the right sources. Because everybody can write a book. I mean, you go into Target and you look down the shelves and you look at all the garbage books and you're like, how do I know which ones I should read and which ones I should? And there definitely are books that it's like you pick it up and it's like, it's not worth your time. We have limited time. You have to choose to be wise with what you do. And so Solomon is saying, make sure when you're being admonished by something that it matches up with what the Bible says. That doesn't mean you only read sacred. That doesn't mean you only read Christian sources, because a lot of those are garbage too. But he's saying, when you have wisdom, true wisdom will agree with the Bible. True wisdom will come back and eventually teach you something that you could find, at least principally, in the pages of the Scripture. And so he's saying, by these words, my son, be admonished. Specifically Ecclesiastes, but I think in the broader sense, things that are biblical. And he says, and again, he's just reminding us of the making of many books that there is no end. And this was before the printing press, so that's quite a statement. That I don't know if he could use the word many today. He'd be like, I don't even have a word big enough for that. But you think, pre-printing press, you've got a guy who's saying, yeah, people write a ton of books. And you're like, really? What do you consider a ton? But okay, I guess, they had libraries, so they must have. So it's just something to think about as we kind of wrap up that part of Ecclesiastes. But again, Ecclesiastes kind of builds to that crescendo. Again, he's concluding his entire book with a few statements. So he makes some comments on his legacy. He makes some comments on the words of the wise. And he says, the words of the wise are upright and true. And I think this is important because there are people who would look at Solomon's life and say, you don't have any credibility, Solomon. Like the way you lived, the things you did, I'm not listening to you. But what Solomon is trying to say is the truth is the truth. I worked really hard to get this truth. And I demonstrated with my own life that not living by this truth is a bad thing. And so Solomon is reinforcing his own credentials like he did in chapter 1. And he's saying, I am worth listening to. I may have done a lot of bad things in my life, but listen, because this is still important for you to learn. And then what he's doing is he's going to boil down basically the whole book, and he's going to say this. He says, God's words are upright and true. Okay, the words of the wise. He talks about these things. He's also going to make the conclusion that God's words are profitable. Okay, that's what we saw earlier in the book of Ecclesiastes. So as you study God's words, these are some of the things that you can pull out of the book of Ecclesiastes. not specifically this chapter, but this is kind of a summary. God's words are going to be the ones that are profitable for finding advantage. Like I said, I've had some interactions with some people lately, and there are some people out there who we have the joke of those people who say there are no absolutes, and you say, well, are you absolutely sure? Not exactly helpful in an actual conversation with a person. Well, I didn't do it. But that's something to think about is if you were talking to someone and they had no basis to basically agree with the Bible, you don't even have like an alphabet to use to communicate properly with that person. You basically just ask questions and try to find places of connection that you can grab onto. I was chatting with someone one time and I was like, could we all agree that like there are things that are definitely wrong, like murder and rape and theft? And they're like, well, and then they gave me like a whole big spiel, which was a good one, to be completely honest, on the times where some of those things would be okay or wouldn't be considered wrong.
Like rape?
Well, she was talking about certain cultures where a husband can do whatever he wants with his wife, and I was like, I would still disagree with you that was okay, but in that culture would determine it would be okay, even though it was wrong. And so I was like, we'll talk about it. And it was lunch break conversation over Twitter is not exactly the best time to have a very in-depth conversation about something. But again, are you? Now I realize you're probably not going to get into a lot of those types of conversations quickly. This is a long-term relationship, friendship, talking over something and trying to hash this out. But you see, we're building off a conclusion. But the fun thing about Ecclesiastes is it's universally true whether you agree with the Bible or not. Like I said, I've chatted with formerly very rich people, who would agree with the conclusions of Ecclesiastes to the best of my knowledge. There are, and John would know better on this one, but like some of those business books that you read, they're very much based off of Proverbs. Isn't that? Yeah.
Call it a good one.
Yeah, and that's the thing, like, truth is truth, whether they acknowledge it's from the Bible or not. And that's the beauty of it, is we can look at the Bible and say, the Bible matches reality. There are times where there's things that I'm like, I don't know how that works. I don't understand that passage. But on the whole, we can say, I look at all of this here, and it all makes sense and matches reality. So when I take this little chunk over here, I can say, I just don't understand it yet. And so that's like the problem of evil. I can look at all this stuff and say, okay, I can believe some things about God. I don't get this. Okay, might be more study for you. But the fact is, God's word are going to be profitable. They are going to be a way to find advantage. It doesn't guarantee an advantage, but it is the best way to do it. All right? God's words are goads. So the words of the wise are as goads and as nails fastened by the masters of assembly. They are going to prod you to a conclusion. You should let the Bible do that. As you study the Bible and read the Bible, it's going to be like a cattle prod in your backside. It's going to either prod you to a destination, or it's just going to hurt. Or you're going to build up some really good calluses, and then you're not going to feel it anymore. Which is why the Bible would say, do not let your conscience be seared, as with a hot iron. Because if you think about what a hot iron is, it is basically like a really, really big goat. Okay, in our nomenclature, an iron is this. In their day, it would have been closer to the goat. So put the different parts of the Bible together, and you'll see they're all saying the same thing. And they're like that. God's words, like I said, are nails. They're going to ground you, and God's words are given by one shepherd, which means they're all ultimately coming from one source, and so you can go back to that source. Okay. Again, as we wrap it up, he is going to give some commands. He's going to say this: you need to listen to what I say. Okay. The temptation is, in our own wisdom, to deny it. Solomon's going to have something to say about that. He's also going to say, be careful about other sources of wisdom, and don't listen to every word that's said. Much study is weariness. So there are times where you say, you know what, I like that chapter of this book, and I don't like that. Because the only perfect source we have is going to be the book of Ecclesiastes. So there are times where I do a book review, or I reference books, and I'm like, I'm not saying you should take for gospel every word in this book, but it is a good overview. It is a good summary of the topic at hand. And so, if you walk into my office and you're like, well, what do you think about that book? Well, since it's sitting on my shelf, I probably like it. But I probably don't wholesale recommend it because, well, that would just be dumb. The only book I can wholesale recommend is the Bible, and even that I don't fully understand. But the other books, even though I understand them more, there are going to be parts I say, I don't agree with that part. So again, he's going to study, finish that whole study, and show the answer to Hevel in the book. Okay. We then get to the very, very end of the book, and it says this: "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." So remember, Solomon's been building throughout the whole time, talking about injustice and good and grief and profit and all that stuff. And he comes to the end and he's like, all right, let's just kind of wrap this whole mess up. What's the conclusion? Like, where do we get to? Like, we're here, what are we at? And he says, all right, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Your whole job as a human is to fear God, keep his commandments. That's it. I mean, it's really nice to put it like that. Fear God, keep his commandments. And you're like, well, which ones? Well, I mean, the one that pertains to you right now. There are commands, obviously, you cannot keep. You're not a Jewish person. That means you can't keep temple. So there's things like that. But the commands that apply to you, and I see this a lot when I was in college and seminary, and you got the guys who argue back and forth on well, is it okay to do this? How about this? And you have a bunch of guys who've never really studied anything in depth, pooling their collective ignorance and trying to make up conclusions on life. It basically is that way. It's frustrating, and it's very simplistic, and you've got guys who are a lot of bluster, but they don't have a lot of support underneath them, and they just go back and forth. And I think that is why throughout the Bible it'll say things like, avoid foolish and unlearned questions. Don't debate about genealogies. Don't argue about some of these trifles. Because the point is, if our purpose is to keep God's commandments, I'm sorry, but the genealogies have absolutely nothing to do with keeping God's commandments. They have nothing to do with fearing God. So why are we having an argument about this? And you could have all the argument about, is this sin to do? But the question is, okay, that might be a good hypothetical for if you're ever in that situation. But are you ever going to be in that situation? Would it be a sin for a first century Jewish man to... Are you ever going to be in the first century as a Jewish man? No. So why are you asking the question? Oh, I mean, just curious minds want to know. Okay, well, fear God and keep his commandments. That's pretty much what it can be summarized down to. I'm not saying we shouldn't ask questions, and I do enjoy a good hypothetical as much as the next guy. But part of that is where Jesus gets on the Pharisees' case. And he gets on the Pharisees' case because he's like, hey guys, you know what, you're doing the tithe thing real well. Like, you're tithing of your mint and your cumin, and he's like, you've got everything down. Like, you're brought in 1/10 of that plant. That was good. But you left some other major parts undone. Like justice and mercy. And he's like, and so that's why if I'm talking to someone and they're like, what is God's will? I really come down to two verses. I come down to Ecclesiastes 12, which says, fear God and keep his commandments. And I come down to Micah 6:8, which is, he has showed thee, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of thee but to do justly? So if you're in a case where you need to do the just thing, do the just thing. He says, love mercy, which means there are times where you could bring the hammer down on someone, but you may need to have mercy on them for various reasons. And then the final part of that Micah 6:8 is to walk humbly with your God, which is a very hard thing to do. All right? It's hard. It's hard to walk humbly. And so Micah 6:8 is reminding us, specifically if you have any sort of authority, you need to do the just thing, you need to do a merciful thing, and you need to do the humble thing. Because you're humbly walking with God, which then gives you a humble attitude with other Christians or other people in general. And as you see that theme, that carries through 2 Peter 1, where it talks about loving other Christians and loving everybody. It goes to 1 John, where it talks about if you don't love the brethren, then you really don't love God, and the love of the Father is not in you. So if you're not walking humbly with God, it doesn't correlate out to other people. Like, the scripture, like, I saw a picture one time, I wish I could find it, but they showed all the connections between the different verses of scripture, and it's this big timeline that goes out like this, and you just see, like, I mean, it is the most hyperlinked book ever. I mean, it is ridiculous. Like if you were to put the Bible like a hyperlink, you would have blue text everywhere that you could click and it would take you to another section of the Bible. I mean, it would absolutely amazing how this all connects together. And Solomon is echoing the same thing Micah would say, the same thing people in the New Testament would say. And our conclusion is we have to fear God and keep his commandments because, look at verse 14, for God will bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. Now we finished all of Ecclesiastes. Obviously there was a section in the middle there that we didn't explain all of it. So I do want to take a moment and do that. Not all of it, obviously. But I want to take questions or comments because I realize some of that Ecclesiastes 12 is fairly weighty. It brings up some issues. And then last week's session on suffering, all that obviously brings up issues as well. So I want to comment on those if there are any, and then I want to go back and kind of hit some key passages throughout Ecclesiastes on the off chance that this is truly the last session. Because if it is, I want to cover a few more things really quick, and then we'll call it a year. So any questions or comments? Okay, let's go back to Ecclesiastes 5. So Ecclesiastes 5 is around where we left off, and I want to touch on this one really quick. This is one of those that is, it makes sense. So I'll explain it once you get there. So Ecclesiastes chapter 5, and it says, "Keep thy foot when thou goest into the house of God, and be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they consider not that they do evil." Now I realize when you hear that passage, you're like, I don't really get what you're talking about. But if you remember back at the beginning of this series, I covered Ecclesiastes chapter 5 in the notes. I believe it would be about page 19. Yeah, page 18, I guess. If you remember back at the beginning of the notes, we were going over like Jewish poetry. Remember we said there was a type of Jewish poetry where they would give you a statement and they would immediately give you the contrast. Okay? I want you to think about that because as we explain this, I want you to pay attention because look what it says. "Keep thy foot when thou goest into the house of God." So you're going into a place of worship, you're going into a sacred place. All right? If you're going into a sacred place, you obviously should be like on a whole new level of respect. Make sense? So I don't know if you've ever been into like a grand old cathedral. So there's a massive like Catholic church in New York City that's just huge and just awe-inspiring. And then you have the Notre Dame Cathedral up in Montreal, not the actual original one from France, but it's called the Notre Dame, and it is really impressive. Like you walk in and they have the soaring ceilings and just the Notre Dame Cathedral in Montreal originally had a big stained glass window behind where the priest stood, but they realized that's where like the sun went down or whatever, and so it would just blind anyone who, so they had to like wall it over. And those buildings were built on purpose to evoke the grandeur of what they were in. Like you're in the presence of God, you should have a little bit of awe, you know. And while they put probably too much into the spectacle and not enough into the theology, I think their mindset was correct in when you walk into a church or a place of worship, so to speak, there should be a reverence of, we are assembling to worship. We should take this seriously. Now, it's not saying you shouldn't enjoy yourself, or, you know, all that, Ecclesiastes 11. But you notice that when you walk into some of those really old churches, you instinctively start to get a little quieter. I don't know about you. I have noticed that, and I've noticed that with people around me who aren't even religious people, to my knowledge. Like you walk in and you just immediately you start to whisper and you start to kind of treat it like there's more respect. And you're like, I'm in a Catholic church. Why am I doing this? You know, why am I in a Catholic church? But have you ever, I don't know if you noticed that. And the point, that's kind of what Ecclesiastes 5 is getting at in verse 1. Because what it's saying is, you should not walk into the house of God in a figurative sense and suddenly be like, hey everybody, I am going to do this and I'm going to do that and I am going to serve God in this way. It says that you to keep your foot when you go into the house of God and be more ready to hear. So this is where the poetry comes in, because it's explaining what was just said. Then to give the sacrifice of fools. According to Proverbs and other places in the Bible, what are fools most known for?
Being foolish.
Being foolish, but in pertaining to this type of issue.
No knowledge of God, fools that are of God.
Okay? So they have no knowledge of God, they're just, okay? And how do you know what a fool is thinking?
They say it really
They-
obviously.
They say it. It's like the old joke, how do you know if someone's a lawyer or a teacher? They'll tell you. But that's what it is. Like, have you ever met a teacher? I'm a teacher. It's like, I don't care. And it's how it is. It's like people. Yeah. But that's how people are. Like you see them, and you're like, oh, okay, thank you. I don't walk up and be like, I'm a camp guy. What? I don't care. But there are certain occupations where people instinctively tell you what they are, and you're like, I guess you're used to talking all day, so you just feel the need to tell me. A fool, I'm not saying a fool is a teacher, but a fool is just like that too. The Bible will say that a fool is known by his words. So you've got a fool who's going to come in, and the only sacrifice he has to offer is big talk. And so the Bible says, when you go into the house of God, you should be more willing to and just hear than to give the sacrifice of fools, which is empty talk. And he says, because they consider not that what they do is evil. And then he continues to further this case by verse 2. He says, be not rash in thy mouth. Okay? That does not mean don't get a rash in your mouth. It means do not be quick with your tongue to say anything. So there are times where that sharp retort or that, ooh, I'll do that, probably is not the best. There are times where you sit there in quiet. Someone might think they won the argument. That's okay. It's better to be quiet than to be quick with your mouth and then be like, oh. So be not rash in thy mouth to utter anything. Okay, and it says, let not your heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven, and thou upon earth, therefore let thy words be few. This is echoed in the Proverbs of the New Testament, which is James. And in Proverbs of the New Testament, which is James, which is the most Jewish book in the New Testament, because most likely it was written first. There's some argument, so we don't know for sure. But James is extremely Jewish in a lot of ways. And what James will do is he'll say, hey, my brethren, be not many masters, knowing you shall receive the greater condemnation. And you're like, what does that mean? Basically, the idea is you should not, all of you should not seek to be a teacher. That's what the word masters. It's the same idea as masters of assembly, the Kohelet. It's that same concept. It was rabbi, but same concept. So he's saying you should not all be quick to be teachers because you will receive the greater condemnation. Because teachers talk a lot, which means there are times where a person who is up front speaking is going to spitball something because they don't know it for sure, and so they're just throwing an idea out. And that's going to contradict something else they said, and guess what happens? The moment they get well known enough, people start pouring over everything they said, and now they've received all sorts of extra condemnation, and you're like, leave them alone. It's like, well, they put themselves out there, so they deserve it. It's like, okay, I guess I get what you're saying. And so James is saying you should be very hesitant to jump into something because it's going to be a very condemnable situation to be in. And the same thing is here with Ecclesiastes, where he's saying if you're a fool, you're going to walk into a religious situation or a sacred situation, you're just sputtering off at the mouth. Well, you're going to be held accountable for that. So be very careful. He actually talks about don't let your mouth. My dad used to say, don't let your mouth write out a check your butt can't cash for you. But what Ecclesiastes would say is, don't let your mouth write out a check that will lead you into sin. It's not as poetic. My dad was quite the bard. But again, it's that idea of let your words be few, because the fewer things you say, the fewer things you're now accountable for, and you're going to be held to account for it. So just be really careful. He goes on, he says, a dream cometh through the multitude of business, and a fool's voice is known by the multitude of words. When thou vowest a vow unto God, so he's continuing the same theme. You notice the pattern here with your words. When you vow a vow unto God, defer not to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. So this is what the sacrifice of fools is. They talk big talk. My sacrifice is, I gave you a bunch of fancy words, and God's like, I made your mouth, I don't care. I mean, that's kind of this idea. He's giving big fancy words, and he says, when you vow a vow unto the Lord, do not hesitate to pay it. Like, you better keep that word, because he does not have any pleasure in fools, so pay what you vowed. Better is it that you should not vow than you should vow and not pay. The story I can think of in the New Testament where this ties in is Ananias and Sapphira. Ananias and Sapphira is a perfect example of this, because everyone in the church was doing something that wasn't commanded. It was good, but it was not commanded. At no point did they say, sell all your stuff and give it all up. They loved God so much, they were like, we're just going to sell all our stuff and just give it up. And so you had some guys who did that really, really well, and Ananias and Sapphira were like, dude, they're getting some serious credit for this. We want on board this train. And so what they did is they sold their stuff, kept back a bunch of the money, because they're like, we're not going to give it all, but we're going to say we gave it all, and that way people look at us the same way. And you know what happened. And so this idea of, and in fact, the very language is used there that said, when it was your own, did you not have authority to do what you will with it? Like, you had the ability to keep back some of it. Why did you tell us otherwise? You didn't lie to me, you lied to God. And that's this idea of, there are a lot of times where we say things to people to impress them. But understand, when you promise something to God, but you're saying it to another person, you are making a vow that God is going to expect you to keep. And he's saying, you better keep it. Now he continues with this. Look at it. Better that thou should not vow than you should vow and not pay. Now look at verse 6. Suffer not, or don't allow your mouth to cause your flesh to sin. Because there are things you will say that you then have to keep your word. And there may be something you say that if you kept your word, it would be a sin. So congratulations, you've just now sinned one way or the other. So the idea is, he's saying, be so careful with what you promise, with what you say you'll do, because it may not be possible for you to do it, which means you're either going to have to, let's say, break the law to do it, or you're going to have to lie to not do it. It's better you just not say anything. And that's this idea of, the whole first part of this passage is all about being careful with your words so you don't get yourself into trouble. All right? And again, he says, neither say unto the angel that it was an error. So, when the messenger comes and is like, hey, you've got to deliver on this, you're like, oh, no, it was a mistake. And that's kind of our cop-out. It was like, oh, I didn't mean to. It's like, well, but you said it. Yeah, but I didn't mean to. Well, how do I know if you meant to or not? Well, I would do it. Okay. And that, so he's saying, don't, when the angel comes and calls you on it, don't be like, it was a mistake. Okay? And look what he says. Wherefore should God be angry at thy voice and destroy the works of thy hand? And that's this idea, like, God can pour out and will some pretty serious judgment for people who be like, no, I'll do it, and then don't. There is a reason why God says that Satan is the father of lies. Because God is truth, and this lying is such a terrible thing to him. Now it keeps going. For in the multitude of dreams and many words there are diverse vanities, but, and we saw this conclusion earlier, fear thou God. Now he keeps going. Remember I said when I'm talking about God's will, I come to two passages. I come to Ecclesiastes 12, which talks about fear God, keeps commandments. I come to Micah 6, do justly, love mercy, walk humbly. Look at this. He's just talked about walking humbly with your God. And that really is what that whole first part of this book is. You're walking humbly with God, saying, I'm not going to say anything that could be a lie. I'm not going to say anything that could be a vow I couldn't keep. I'm going to do the right thing by not being a fool. But look at this very next part, verse 8. If you see oppression of the poor and the violent perverting of judgment and justice so justice becomes another major thing he focuses on. Now, his point here is not necessarily to call people to do justice, because that's already been said. But look at it. Verse 8. If you see the oppression of the poor, the violent perverting of judgment and justice in the province, marvel not at the matter, for he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they. Okay, so he's saying, if you're looking at injustice in the world, go right now. If you're looking at something and you're like, why is no one doing anything about this? He's like, don't marvel at it. Like, don't marvel at this injustice. One, because it's just a human condition. But understand like, you can't be shocked. There is one higher than them that's watching all of this. So I want you to imagine, like, let's say you're a camper here, and you're a camper, and you're watching this counselor do something that's just bad. And you're like, what is going, like, why is no one doing anything like that? Why is no one doing anything about that counselor? And that, the counselor is, let's say, yelling at someone or something, nothing too bad, okay? But the counselor's doing something wrong, and you as a camper are standing there going, why is that counselor, what's going on? But then you look over and you see on Miners Hall porch, and like John's standing there just looming over, just watching the whole situation. He's watching the whole thing, and you're watching going, okay, he knows what's going on. I'm gonna leave that to him. Like, just imagine that scenario. You're a powerless camper going, I don't know if I should step in or not. And then you look over and you see, boss man hovering over the whole situation, and you're like, ooh, that's not gonna end well for that counselor. And you see the scowl or something, so you know that he's not condoning it. It's not like, no. That's basically the picture Solomon's trying to paint. Solomon is saying, you are looking at injustice in the world. You're looking at, whatever courts there are that just did not rule right on that situation. Or you're looking at judges or officers or politicians, and you're like, how can they get away with it? This is so terrible. What do I do? And he's like, don't marvel at it. God's watching, and he's about to take care of it. He's looking off Miners Hall porch. He's watching that whole situation, and ooh, boy, you don't want to be them when that comes crashing down. Like, you want to be as far away from them as possible when that all comes crashing down. So that's his idea. Okay, he says, verse 9, again, the justice and judgment and all that, what he's doing is he's saying, like, if you are a foolish and wicked person, God's going to judge you. He's going to turn his gaze away from you. So if you're a king and you're doing the unjust thing and you're doing a wicked thing, just remember God's power. Remember what God has at his disposal to come after you. So you might think, like, I have the greatest military. And look what he says in verse 9. Moreover, the profit of the earth is for all. The king himself is served from the field. So it's like, guess what? God has ways of getting at you. And you're really not any better than any other man. Verse 10, he that loveth silver will not be satisfied with silver. He that loveth abundance with increase. This is also vanity. And so he's making comments on the vanity of rulership, but there are truths here as well where, yeah, sure, that guy might be unjust and terrible and great, but look at his terrible life. Don't envy that. You don't want to be that person. You think that's good? You think that's pleasurable? You think that's happy? Nah. And he's saying, like, if you're someone who is a lustful, unjust, terrible person, you're not going to be satisfied with the stuff you're cheating and stealing to get. Let's play the political case. Let's say the Democrats the election, whatever. Okay, so let's say Joe Biden, president-elect. Let's say he's the election, he gets in. You think it's really going to make him happy and satisfied? Nope. It's going to be a very miserable existence. I'm pretty sure with the life he's already lived, there have been a lot of situations that are just a miserable existence. Why would you want that? Why would you envy that? Why would you be like, I want to be that guy? It's like, no, that's miserable. I'm far happier living in a, little cottage packed to the gills with little small children. It's way better than living in that. Sure, you have the respect, but you also have the hatred of so many other people. I'm good. Why would I do that to myself? And so again, he's just reminding him, like, yes, there are people who are unjust. There are people who do the wrong thing. There are people who chase after stuff, and you're like, man, I wish I had, $83 billion. And it's like, yeah, but look at their home situation. Look at their life. Look at the drug abuse and alcohol, and look at the stuff that they have to do to kind of live each day. Is that really, you want to envy that? And I forget what passage it is in the Psalms, but you've got, I think it's Asaph or one of those guys who's talking. He's like, I was almost in all evil in the midst of the congregation. And he's like, I envied them here and I envied them there. And then he gets to the end and he's like, but then I went into the house of the Lord and I considered their end. Man, I'm not envious of them anymore. And so that's kind of this idea. Remember, Solomon's dad wrote some of those Psalms. So very well, Solomon could be aware of some of those songs and go, yeah, I remember that. So there's a lot there. Just to close out, I do want to turn over one more passage. Look, this is like my favorite one to quote. Turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Ecclesiastes chapter 7. I want to cover a few details here, and we'll call it a day. Ecclesiastes chapter 7. There's two passages in Ecclesiastes chapter 7 that I use a whole ton, and so I have to apologize. It's just the way I am, but also they're just such good passages. So the first one is Ecclesiastes 7:7. Ecclesiastes 7:7. It's bringing up, again, part of an overall context. You can read the notes if you want the full context. But in Ecclesiastes 7:7, it says, "Surely oppression maketh a wise man mad, and a gift destroyeth the heart." Just a fun passage. If you understand it, it's an encouraging passage if you understand it. Ecclesiastes 7:7 basically says, you could be a wise, godly, great person, and under the right oppression, you can crack. We talked about that last week, I believe. I reference it so much, I forget when I've referenced it. But again, the idea of surely oppression maketh the wise man mad, that word mad can mean a whole bunch of different things. But in the context, it is used in the life of David when he pretended to be insane. So if you want the cross-reference to that, it would be 1 Samuel 12:3. And in 1 Samuel 12:3, I believe, is the cross-reference there. But it's the story of King David. That actually doesn't sound right. If it was 1 Samuel, it would be... Anyway. But in the passage, David goes to the Philistines. He's trying to hide from Saul, which are like, David, you're running from one enemy to like a worse enemy. I don't know if you thought this one through. And he goes like right into the king. And David realizes, oh, they know about Goliath. I mean, it's like, David, you're kind of well known. And it's just funny. And so David starts drooling into his beard and scrabbling at the door. And the king looks and goes, do I, like, are you guys playing with me? Like, do I need another madman in this place? And that's the language he used. Do I need another madman? And so the idea is insane. I've heard preachers use this where they're like, surely oppression makes a wise man mad, so when bad things start happening, you need to get angry. And I'm like, that's not what mad means in this context. Like, I literally heard him say, like, you need to get angry, and that's why you need to fight back against the government. I'm like, you're misinterpreting that verse. But again, the word mad has a wide range of meanings in English, but this specifically is talking about, like, insanity. Because you look at the very next passage, and a gift destroyeth the heart, it's the idea of, like, you could be firmed up being like, I will never move, and someone's like, well, how about for $1 billion? And you're like, you know what? I just discovered some new reasons why I think I'm okay with doing that. That's this idea. Like, if you bribe someone, they will sometimes do things they otherwise wouldn't have done. A gift destroyeth the heart. So that's why Proverbs will say this. That's why if you are going to meet with someone and you really want them to be sympathetic to your cause, you bring a gift. It's biblical. It's basically a bribe. Because what happens is, someone could really hate you, and you walk up with their favorite thing, and you're like, hey, I got you something. And they're like, oh, well, thank you. Hey, can we have a talk? Oh, sure. You've destroyed their hostility toward you because you gave them something. That's a good way that this passage is used. But this idea of surely oppression makes a wise man mad, we need to understand that we could be like firm and solid, but the right push could break us. We're not as strong as we think. And that's why the Bible's constantly going to tell us to rely back on God, make sure you're renewing your heart. You know, you're not like a mountain that's like, I am here and I shall never be moved. Well, no, you're more like a sandcastle. And as long as that wave doesn't hit you just right, you'll stay standing, sure. But there's a toddler coming down the beach, so you may want to, fix some things. So it's that idea of that. The other passage in Ecclesiastes 7, and we'll end on this, is Ecclesiastes 7:21. This is one I use all the time. I butcher it. You'd think I would have this one memorized. I don't. I butcher this one every single time, and I give you the summary if you ever talk to me about it. Ecclesiastes 7:21 says, also, now granted, it's part of a huge discussion in cases here, but in Ecclesiastes 7:21 it says, also take no heed unto all the words that are spoken, lest you hear your servant curse thee. So he's saying, when you are minding your own business and you hear someone talking, don't pay attention to every little thing they said. This is a weakness of mine, because I tend to try to be careful with my words, which means if it sounded like I insulted you, I probably did. It's not all the time, but I know how to carefully word a phrase to insult you without you knowing. So if you think I did, I'm sorry, I probably did. This is where it's weak for me because I assume everyone else does the same. And so if I hear someone say something and I'm like, well, that was really insulting. And if I had said it, I would have meant it like that. You know what? I'm ticked off. And really, someone was just saying something off the cuff, and you're like, but you really deeply insulted me. And it's like, yeah, but they weren't thinking. Like, they weren't actually thinking about what that turn of phrase meant. Oh, so stop it. And that's the idea. He's saying, don't take thought to every word you hear someone say about you. Because, look at verse 3, for oftentimes, don't take thought to every word that's said, because you will hear people curse you when they didn't mean to curse you. Okay? Verse 22, for oftentimes also thine own heart knoweth that thou thyself likewise have cursed others. Very fancy, poetic way of saying, you do the same thing. So don't be so upset with someone else for doing something when you're doing the same thing. There's a reason I have not been able to memorize this verse. It's just worded in such a way that I just can't quite get it. But the idea is, don't take thought to every word you hear someone say. They're probably not intending it that bad. And even if they are, even if they are the most spiteful, terrible person ever, and they really did mean to stick it in deep and twist, you do the same thing. You know, it's like walking out of the house wearing a white shirt, seeing someone else wearing a white shirt and being like, how could you wear a white shirt, you monster? And they're like, I mean, that's stupid, but that is the illustration of we say things to tear people down all of the time. But the moment we hear someone tearing us down, we're like, how? I thought we were friends. I only talk about you behind your back. I mean, that's basically the equivalent. All right. And then I like verse 23, just in case you doubt his credibility. He's like, all of this I have proved by my wisdom. I have said I will be wise, and it was far from me. And so he's like, I kept working at it. So again, the end of that chapter talks about a lot of wisdom. The reason I say there's a bunch of meanings to the word mad, if you're curious, is because a similar word is used in the beginning of chapter 8, which when I was studying this really confused me because I was like, I don't get how that works. But let's see, I don't remember which word exactly it is. I think it's the idea of the face to shine in Ecclesiastes 8:1. I think the word shine there is the same word for mad in 7:7. It's something like that. I think it's like halal or I'm not sure the exact word. It's been a long time since I've looked at it. But it was just weird to me because I was like, oh, maybe I'm completely misinterpreting it. But when I found the David passage, I was like, okay, that makes more sense in the context. So, did you find? Okay. So anyway, like I said, there is a lot of other stuff here in the book of Ecclesiastes. I would recommend reading it. Compare it with the notes. If you have any other questions, please let me know. But there we go. We're going to end this for the year, and we'll see what next year brings. So.